All right, I'm back. Let's talk about the brain. The cerebrum is the structure responsible for our higher mental functions. The anatomy of the cerebrum, if you've seen one, it's covered with these little hills and valleys. The shallow grooves on the surface of the brain, the valleys, are referred to as sulci. The singular for that is sulcus. The hills or elevated ridges are the gyri. Again, that's the plural term. The singular term is gyrus. Together, they increase the surface area of the brain and maximize the limited space available within the confines of the skull. Again, fitting that structure and function principle. It's made the way it is so it can do its job, and it can do its job because it's of the way it is made. The fissures are deep grooves on the surface of the cerebrum. Now the sulci, back up one slide. The sulci are going to be these sort of shallow grooves. Fissures are going to be much deeper. They are found on the surface of the cerebrum. There's one called the longitudinal fissure, which separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres. It has a cavity deep within the cerebral hemisphere. The right hemisphere surrounds the right lateral ventricle. The left hemisphere surrounds the left lateral ventricle. And so here's the cerebrum. Here's that large central sulcus that we were talking about. Or excuse me, the longitudinal sulcus. Longitudinal fissure. I'll get it out in a minute. That's the longitudinal fissure, dividing it into left and right. There it is right there. 5 lobes are found in each of the each hemisphere of the cerebrum. You have the frontal lobe, you have the parietal lobe, you have a temporal lobe, you have an occipital lobe, and you have the insula. The insula is not shown on this particular picture. It will show up here in just a moment because it's deep within the brain. But here's the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Think about the brain, the bones of the skull. Remember, we have a frontal bone, parietal bone, a temporal bone, and an occipital bone. Well, it just so happens that the frontal bone lies over the frontal lobe. The parietal bone lies over the parietal lobe, etc., etc. There's a lateral fissure right there, separating the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. 5 lobes. The frontal lobes are the most anterior. They have a central sulcus on the back edge, the posterior border. The neurons are responsible for planning, executing movement, complex mental functions such as behavior, conscious, and personality. 100 years ago, if someone suffered from schizophrenia, they may, while in a what was referred to at the time as an insane asylum, they may undergo a treatment called a frontal lobotomy, where the frontal lobes of the brain are actually either removed or destroyed through a surgical procedure, and in hopes that it would correct their personality issues. Thankfully, we do not do these anymore as a treatment for mental illness. Yes, there might be a reason to do a frontal lobotomy today, but it would not be because somebody had a mental illness. The parietal lobes lie just posterior to the frontal lobes. There's one on either side. They contain the postcentral gyrus, which is the posterior to the central sulcus. The neurons are responsible, again, for processing and integrating sensory information and function in attention. Most of the medications that children take nowadays for ADHD and those kinds of things act on the neurons in the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe are the lateral surfaces. Think of where your temples are. Everybody knows where their temples are. Everybody's had at least one temporal headache in their life, more than likely. These are the lateral surfaces. They're separated from the parietal and frontal lobes by the lateral fissure. Again, these are neurons that are involved in hearing, language, memory, and emotion. The occipital lobes toward the back is the posterior aspect of each central cerebral hemisphere. These are separated from the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. The neurons process all the information related to vision. The insulas lie deep underneath the lateral fissures. The neurons are currently thought to be involved in functions related to taste and viscera. Then viscera, again, are the internal organs, the stomach, the liver, the kidneys, and those things. Again, here is the central sulcus separating the frontal from the parietal lobes. Here's the occipital lobe. There's the temporal lobe, and there we're peeling back these two lobes to show the insula, which lies directly over the diencephalons. Gray matter is functionally the most complex part of the cerebral cortex. Covers the underlying cerebral hemispheres. Most of the cerebral cortex is what is referred to as the neocortex. It's the most recently evolved part of the brain. Has a huge surface area because of all those folds and the gyri and the sulci. It's composed of 6 layers of neurons and neuroglia. The 6 layers are of variable widths, and all the neurons in this cortex are interneurons. The function of the neocortex revolves around conscious processing, again, planning movement, interpreting sensory information, complex higher functions. The neocortex is divided into 3 areas. You have the primary motor cortex. That's the primary motor, which is how we're going to move. Primary sensory cortices, and cortices is the plural of the word cortex. But so you have the primary sensory cortices. These are the senses, touch, taste, feel, those kinds of things. And then the association areas. Now, again, primary motor cortex plans and executes movement. Primary sensory cortices are the first regions to receive sensory input. And then from the primary sensory cortices, things move into the association areas. These are the things that integrate different types of information and process them. There's two different areas. You have the unimodal areas, which interpret one specific type of information. Multimodal areas interpret information from multiple sources and carry out many of our higher mental functions. So this one maybe, for instance, is going to give us, we can see an item. These areas take that item that we see and then process it into what it is. And again, the red things are the primary motor cortex. Blue things are the primary sensory cortex. Again, taste and smell and things. Vision's back here, the primary visual cortex. And then we have those association areas. The single tasks are the darker ones, while the multitasks are the lighter colored ones. And we'll talk about Wernicke's areas in a moment and Broca's areas as well. Motor areas, these are mostly located in the front of the brain, contain the motor neurons that connect either to other neurons but not to skeletal muscles. The primary motor cortex involves the conscious planning of movement, located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. So the primary motor cortex. I am going to pick up this tape dispenser. I know you can't see it. I am going to pick up this tape dispenser and move it. The planning for that is in the primary motor cortex. The upper motor neurons of each cerebral hemisphere control the motor activity of the opposite side of the body via the peripheral nervous system neurons. These are the lower motor functions, and they execute the order to move. So if you get hit upside the head by a golf ball on the right side of your head, it could affect your ability to do things with your left arm. And that's what is meant by the opposite side of the body. Folks who have a stroke and are paralyzed on the right side of their body, the stroke was formed in their primary motor cortex on the left side of their brain. Movement requires input from many association areas, such as the large premotor cortex, anterior and primary motor cortexes, the motor association areas. Again, these are unimodal areas that provide or involved in planning, guidance, coordination, and execution. The frontal eye fields are a paired motor association areas, one on each side of the brain, anterior to the premotor cortex. These are involved in the back and forth eye movements as in reading. Most of us read this way. We hold a book and we read this way. Our eyes move from left to right. If you suffer a stroke or brain damage in these frontal eye fields, this is the way you would read. Because you no longer have the ability to move your eyes left and right. It's one of the things they do in the concussion protocols in the NFL. Follow my finger with your eyes. Don't move your head. Follow it with your eyes. And one sign or one possible sign of a concussion is a momentary inability to do that. You can't follow. You have to follow that finger. You got to move your head. And they say, no, don't move your head. Just move your eyes. The two main somatosensory areas in the cerebral cortex deal with the somatic senses. Those are temperature, touch, vibration, pressure, stretch, and joint position. You have the primary somatosensory area found in the post-central gyrus, and the somatosensory area, again, posterior, it's found behind this area. So you have the primary one sits in front, the somatosensory association sits in the back. The special senses, this will be the last thing we discuss this semester, is the special senses, but touch, vision, hearing, smell, and taste each have primary unimodal association areas, as does the equilibrium or balance sense. These are found in all the lobes of the cortex except the frontal lobe. So again, that frontal lobotomy should not affect touch, vision, hearing, smell, taste, and equilibrium. Primary visual cortex at the backside of the occipital lobe is the first area to receive visual input, transfers to the visual association area. This is the area that's going to process color, movement, depth. Again, this lets us see the bird. This tells us it's a blue bird that's, pretty doggone large. The primary auditory cortex is the superior temporal lobe of the brain, the first to receive auditory information. Again, this is the hearing. Input is transferred to the auditory association cortex. So the primary auditory, we hear the sound. The auditory association area, we recognize that sound as music, someone yelling. We recognize it as a trumpet or a clarinet. We recognize it as a siren or a bell. So we hear the sound here, we interpret the sound here. The gustatory cortex is where we get our taste processing. These areas are scattered throughout the insula and both parietal lobes. What we are going to learn later on in the semester, that the sense of taste is very intimately, what's the word I'm looking for here, combined or associated with smell. Taste and smell go together very well. How many of you have had a bad cold, your nose has been really clogged up, and nothing seemed to taste right? That's because taste and smell are closely linked. The vestibular areas, this is where we get our equilibrium and position sensations, the parietal and temporal lobes. We will talk about the equilibrium a little bit later when we talk about the ear and hearing. Our equilibrium centers are found in our middle ear, and we will talk about those. The olfactory processes the sense of smell. It is evolutionarily older regions of the brain. Consists of several areas of limbic and medial temporal in the limbic and medial temporal lobes. Again, as human beings developed, our vision got lots and lots better. Our smell got less and less so. So again, here are all the areas of gray matter, again, from the brain that we just talked about: the prefrontal cortex, the premotor cortex, primary motor cortex, It's primary somatosensory, parietal association areas, the somatosensory areas, there's the visual, and all of those other areas. The multimodal association areas are regions of the cortex that perform complex mental functions, such as language. We have two areas of language. You have the Broca's area, which is the premotor area in the anterior lateral frontal brain. This is what gives us our ability to produce the sounds of speech. So Broca's areas are associated with producing sound. Wernicke areas are found in the temporal and parietal lobes. These give us our ability to understand language. There have been cases of people having strokes that no longer know their language. They can still speak it, but they don't know what they're saying. Generally, it's an understanding thing when the Wernicke areas are damaged. The prefrontal cortex occupies most of the frontal lobe, communicates with the diencephalons and other regions of the cerebral gray matter, and the association areas in many of the lobes of the brain. Many functions of the prefrontal cortex, including modulating behavior, personality, learning, memory, and the individual's personality. The parietal and temporal association areas occupy most of their respective lobes. They have multiple functions, including, again, the interpretation of sensory information, interpretation of language, maintaining attention, recognition, spatial awareness. Again, keep in mind, anything that is an association area is the part of the brain where you're going to put pieces together. You're going to associate this with this. And again, there are all of the different area names, their type of cortex, their location, and their functions. The basal nuclei are found deep within the cerebral hemispheres. They are clusters of large neuron cell bodies. They are involved in movement, separated from the diencephalon by a region of white matter called the internal capsule. They are the caudate nuclei, the putamen, and the globulus pallidus. The caudate nuclei are C-shaped rings of gray matter found lateral to the lateral ventricle of each hemisphere with an anteriorly oriented tail. The putamen are posterior and inferior to the caudus nuclei. They are connected to the caudate nuclei by small bridges of gray matter. The combination of the putamen and the caudate are called the corpus stratum. And the globulus pallidus is found medial. And what does medial mean? Toward the middle or to the inside to the putamen. Contains more myelinated fibers than other regions. And there are that is the structure of, here's the cerebral hemispheres. Here's the globulus pallidus, that sort of dark colored structure. There's the inferior tail. The caudate nuclei is right here. Here, and the putamen is here. The cerebral white matter can be classified as the commensural fissures, the projection fibers or association fibers. The commensural fissures connect to the right and left hemispheres. The corpus callosum is the largest of the four groups. It's found in the middle of the brain at the base of the longitudinal fissure. The projection fibers connect the cerebral cortex of one hemisphere with other areas of the same hemisphere, other parts of the brain and the spinal cord. The corona radiata fibers spread out in a radiating pattern, as its name would imply. They condense around the diencephalon to form two V-shaped bands called internal capsules. And the association fibers are restricted to a single hemisphere that connect the gray matter of the cortical gyri to one another. So here is the cross section of brain. We're looking at the brain from the front. Here we're looking at the brain from the side, and you see the different structures. Here's the internal capsule, the coronae radiata. You see the way they're radiating, the projecting fibers. the association fibers, and the commensular fibers of the corpus callosum. See, it's connecting this side of the brain to this side of the brain. Here on this cross-sectional view, you're seeing the ends of these little blue fibers. You don't see any of these because the way the brain has been cut, but here are the projecting fibers. The limbic system is a pathway for information transferred by conduction of action potentials from one region of the brain to another. The action potential originates in the gray matter. That action potential is sent to another area of gray matter by the projection fibers. A second action potential is generated by the gray matter, which spreads to the neighboring gray matter by the association fibers. A third action potential is then generated, and that can be sent to the other cerebral hemisphere by the commensular fibers. So here's action potential being created here, sent here, then sent here, then sent here. First action potential here, sent to the gray matter here, sent to the gray matter here. So it's going from the deep parts of the brain to the outer parts of the brain to another part of the outer part of the brain, now to the other side from the left to the right. The limbic system is an important functional brain system. It includes the limbic lobe, which is a region of the medial cerebrum, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and certain pathways. Connects each of these regions of gray matter with the rest of the brain. Interestingly, the limbic system is found only within mammalian brains. That is another one of those, when you were in biology class and you discussed those, step into frame, evidence of evolution. This is one of those evidences of evolution that as animals evolved, one of the things that evolved that separated the reptiles from the mammals was the formation of the limbic system. It is involved in memory, learning, emotion, and behavior. The limbic lobe, lobe and associated structures form a ring on the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere. Contains two main gyri, the cingulate gyrus and the para-hippocampal gyrus. The hippocampus is found in the temporal lobe. It's connected to prominent C-shaped ring of white matter called the fornix, which is its main outer output tract. Hippocampus is involved in memory and learning. The amygdala is anterior to the hippocampus, involved in behavior and expression of emotion, especially fear. So here is the limbic system. You have the diencephalons here, fornix, the limbic lobe with the cingulate gyri. There's the parahippocampal gyri. There's the hippocampus right there, and the amygdala. The diencephalons. Let's stop here for a moment, and I'll make another video so these things aren't quite so long.